The crimson warning's siren swept across the glass walls of the city's largest textile technology center, ripping through the luxurious atmosphere of the International Fashion Show's opening night. 50 state-of-the-art digital weaving machines, the $5 million pride of the corporation, instantly froze like a herd of iron monsters turned to stone. The LED lights on the central control panel blinked relentlessly in a deadly shade of red, signaling an anonymous system error that not a single line of programming code could define. There were only exactly 20 hours left before 50 representatives from European fashion houses would step into this auditorium. A contract worth $30 million, along with the CEO's heavily shaking chair, all depended on the premium silk fabrics that were supposed to be woven tonight. Amidst the chaos of engineers in white lab coats, frantically pounding on keyboards, the sharp clack of high heels nenched down the polished concrete floor. Victoria, the young CEO of the conglomerate, walked in with a freezing face and eyes as sharp as a razor blade. She didn't look at the sweating crowd. Her eyes locked directly onto two figures, standing huddled near the entrance. It was a middle-aged man in a faded jacket stained with jet-black grease, standing next to an 18-year-old girl, tightly clutching a bundle of raw fabric in her hands. They were Arthur and his daughter, who had just been bluntly rejected in the final scholarship interview round just minutes prior. Victoria stopped dead in front of them, her expensive perfume completely overpowering the raw smell of machine oil emitting from Arthur. She raised an eyebrow, her eyes filled with utter contempt as she looked at the worn bundle of fabric in the young girl's hands. Where is security? Why are people who smell like a pile of garbage allowed in the high-tech zone? Do you know that a single milligram of dust from that tattered jacket could destroy the laser sensors of this $1 million system? Victoria's voice echoed through the internal PS system, causing every engineer to look up. Arthur's young daughter, Amelia, lowered her head, her thin shoulders trembling with humiliation. She tightened her grip on the fabric bundle against her chest, her fingers red from staying up all night by the old sewing machine to complete her exam entry. But Arthur did not bow his head. He stood tall, the broad shoulders of a man who had spent half his life in textile factories, never wavering under the pressure of wealth. He gently extended an arm forward, shielding his daughter instinctively. His hands bore no diamond rings like Victoria's. They were covered in rough calluses and faint scars, left by needle pricks and biting gears. We are only waiting to receive my daughter's rejected application file, ma'am, Arthur said, his voice deep and remarkably calm, without a trace of resentment or fear. We will leave as soon as your secretary returns it. There is no need for security. Victoria burst into laughter, a dry, hollow laugh devoid of warmth. She glanced at the blinking red control board, then turned back to the rusty screwdriver poking out of Arthur's pants pocket. Look at yourself, old man. The era of men holding hammers and screwdrivers to tap every single screw died 10 years ago. My corporation runs on algorithms, artificial intelligence, and million-dollar brains from Silicon Valley. Cheap manual labor and grease-covered people like you have no place here. Don't think standing here watching will let you steal our technology. Before Victoria's insult could even fade, a dry, sharp crack echoed from beneath machine number 1, the central unit, controlling the entire production line. A thin plume of smoke rose, carrying the acrid stench of overheated metal grinding. The head engineer's computer screen instantly went completely black. Panic reached its peak. If the central machine died, the entire fleet of 50 digital looms would turn into piles of scrap metal. Arthur did not say another word. He watched the way the smoke drifted, his ear twitching slightly as he caught the exact frequency of the metal impact. Just now, It wasn't a software error. He knew that with absolute certainty. He took Amelia's trembling hand and turned to walk decisively toward the exit, leaving behind the frantic screams of the female CEO and the desperate, rapid pounding of keyboards. He knew that an empire built on arrogance and illusory numbers on a computer screen was about to pay a very heavy price for its disdain toward the core foundations of mechanical engineering. Far away from the chaotic silence of the high-tech industrial park, the quiet suburb lay under the gentle orange hue of the late afternoon sun. Here, tucked away at the dead end of a narrow alley, stood Arthur's small workshop. A weathered, wooden sign hung loosely above the door, its paint peeling off to reveal the faded words, Arthur's Mechanical Sewing and Loom Repair. Inside, the air was completely different from the sterile corporate building. It smelled of heavy lubricants, old iron, and the sweet aroma of dried cinnamon tea that Arthur brewed every morning. This workshop was Arthur's entire world for over 30 years, since the massive state-owned textile mills shut down to make way for modern automation. He had lived among these mechanical relics. The walls were lined with thousands of meticulous, hand-drawn blueprints of old German and Japanese looms long before computers took over the trade. Every gear, every spring, and every heavy flywheel in this room was oiled to perfection. Arthur sat on his low wooden stool, the faded denim jacket from the factory floor draped over his shoulders. He adjusted the desk lamp, its warm light focusing on his worn, calloused hands as he carefully cleaned a tiny tension spring. His fingers, though stiffened by years of hard labor and a worsening case of joint arthritis, moved with an astonishing, rhythmic precision. He did not need a digital monitor to tell him if a part was faulty. He could simply slide his thumb across the surface of a steel rod and feel a microscopic scratch of a single micrometer. Dad, a soft voice broke the heavy silence of the workshop. Amelia stood by the doorway, her eyes still slightly red from the humiliation they had faced at the corporate headquarters. In her hands, she still held the rejected application folder, but she had carefully laid out her design project on the large wooden cutting table. It was a traditional embroidered dress, woven from raw, sustainable hemp fibers, a stark contrast to the synthetic, chemically dyed fabrics produced by Victoria's million-dollar machines. Arthur set his tools down with extreme care. He walked over to his daughter, his heavy footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. He did not offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he placed his massive, grease-stained hand gently on her shoulder. The contrast was striking, the rough, scarred hand of an old factory worker resting on the delicate, pristine fabric his daughter had spent months creating. They didn't even look at the stitching. Dad, Amelia whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back her tears. The seal. She looked at my shoes. She smelled the machine oil on my papers, and she threw it into the bin. She said, "Manual craftsmanship is just a fairy tale for poor people who can't afford real technology." Arthur looked down at the dress. He traced his fingers along the edge of the hemline. The tension of the thread was absolutely flawless, tight enough to endure a lifetime, yet flexible enough to breathe. It was the exact technique his late wife had taught him before she passed away. This dress was not just a fashion project. It was a living piece of their family's history, a legacy built on the patience of human hands. Technology can replicate a pattern 10,000 times in an hour. Amelia, Arthur said, his voice deep, grounded, and entirely free of anger. But it cannot replicate the soul of the person who made it. A computer operates on instructions, but a human hand operates on devotion. Never let someone who only understands profit make you doubt your value. He walked over to an old, heavy iron safe hidden beneath a stack of vintage manuals. He turned the mechanical dial, the heavy iron gears inside clicking smoothly. A sound that always brought a sense of peace to the room. From the velvet-lined interior of the safe, Arthur pulled out a tiny wooden box. Inside the box sat a single, heavily oxidized brass knob, barely the size of a coin. It looked entirely unremarkable, its edges slightly worn down by decades of friction. To anyone else, it was a piece of junk destined for a scrap metal bin. If sold at a junkyard, it wouldn't even fetch 50 cents. Amelia watched curiously as her father picked up the brass piece. She had seen him clean it hundreds of times, treating it with more reverence than if it were made of solid gold. Your mother used this exact knob to calibrate the main feeding axis of the old mechanical looms 40 years ago, Arthur murmured, a faint nostalgic smile appearing on his rugged face. Before the digital age, if a machine vibrated too hard, it would ruin the silk. This little piece of brass was the only thing that absorbed the excess kinetic energy. It was called the heart of the loom. Modern engineers think they have eliminated friction with software, but friction is a law of nature. You cannot program it away. He carefully placed the 50-cent brass knob into the chest pocket of his jacket, right next to his vintage steel screwdriver. It was a habit he never broke. The calm of the evening was suddenly shattered by the harsh, vibrating ring of a telephone on the wall. Arthur didn't move immediately. He rarely received calls at this hour. He walked over and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. On the other end of the line, the voice was not calm. It was frantic, breathless, and filled with a terror that only a collapsing empire could produce. It was the voice of Victoria's chief secretary, calling from the high-tech command center of the multi-million-dollar corporation. The chief secretary's voice on the other end of the phone was trembling so violently that Arthur had to hold the receiver a few inches away from his ear. In the background, the distant, chaotic blare of the corporate factory sirens was still faintly audible, a robotic scream echoing through the wires. "Is this Arthur, the mechanical technician who accompanied the applicant earlier?" The secretary gasped, her polished corporate tone completely shattered by sheer panic. "Please, you need to come back to the headquarters immediately. Machine number 1 has suffered a catastrophic structural lock. The German engineers we contacted via video conference are saying it will take at least 4 days to ship a replacement electronic control module from Munich. But we don't have 4 days. If the line doesn't start moving in 12 hours, our international contracts are dead." Arthur stood perfectly still in the dim light of his workshop, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the cutting table. He looked at Amelia, who was quietly organizing her sketches, her face still bearing the faint shadow of the insult she had endured in that very same building. "I am a retired manual technician, Miss," Arthur replied, his voice a steady anchor against the tide of her hysteria. "Your CEO made it very clear that the era of men with screwdrivers is over. My jacket smells of cheap grease, and I wouldn't want to contaminate your high-tech, million-dollar sensors. But please, sir, I am begging you," the secretary cried, her voice cracking. "The CEO didn't authorize this call. I am calling you on my own initiative, because I saw the way you looked at the machine before you left. You knew something, didn't you? If this facility goes under, 300 factory floor workers will lose their jobs before the weekend." The mention of the 300 workers made Arthur's hand tighten slightly around the receiver. He knew those workers. They weren't the Silicon Valley elites or the high-salaried marketing executives. They were ordinary men and women who relied on those looms to feed their families, much like he had done for decades. He closed his eyes, inhaling the comforting scent of machine oil and cinnamon tea in his shop, before letting out a long, heavy sigh. "I will come," Arthur said quietly, "but I don't work for your company. And I don't work for your money. I am coming to ensure those 300 people have a job tomorrow morning. He hung up the phone. Without a word, he put on his worn denim jacket, feeling the familiar heavy weight of the 50-cent brass knob in his breast pocket and the steel screwdriver in his side pouch. He turned to Amelia, holding out his hand. Come, Amelia. Grab your design folder. Amelia looked up, startled. Dad, why would we go back there after what she said to us? They don't want us. They don't want us, but they need us, Arthur said, his eyes filled with a quiet, unshakable dignity. And tonight, you are going to show that woman exactly what manual craftsmanship is worth. An hour later, Arthur's old, battered pickup truck rattled to a halt outside the grand glass entrance of the corporate headquarters. The sleek, modern building was lit up like a Christmas tree, casting sharp, clinical white light across the empty parking lot. When they stepped inside the production hall, the atmosphere was suffocating. Victoria was standing in the center of the room, her hair slightly disheveled, her expensive white blazer cast aside on a chair. She was furiously arguing with her head engineer, a young man with an advanced degree who was staring helplessly at a tablet screens filled with error codes. What do you mean? Reboot failed? Victoria screamed, her voice hoarse. We have the most advanced AI diagnostic software in the country. How can it not find the source of the mechanical resistance? The software says all electronic circuits are green, ma'am. The engineer stammered, sweat dripping onto his pristine collar. The computer thinks the machine is running perfectly, but the main drive shaft physically will not rotate. It's a ghost error. There is no digital footprint for this malfunction. Because it isn't a digital error, son, a calm, deep voice cut through the shouting. Victoria whipped around, her eyes widening in a mixture of anger and desperate shock as she saw Arthur and Amelia walking toward the central Komaiso moat. The surrounding engineers fell silent, parting way for the old man in the greasy jacket. You? Victoria, he said, her pride instantly flaring up despite the disaster unfolding around her. Who authorized you to be here? This is a restricted area. Did my secretary call you? I don't need a junkyard mechanic trying to use brute force on a $5 million German machine. Arthur didn't even look at her. He walked straight past her, his heavy work boots leaving faint, matte smudges on the polished concrete floor. He stopped right in front of the massive, sleek iron structure of machine number 1. The machine was quiet, but it was emitting a deep, internal heat, the smell of scorched synthetic lubricant rising from its vents. Arthur did not look at the computer screens or the flashing LED diagnostic boards. Instead, he did something that made every young engineer in the room exchange mocking glances. He leaned forward, pressing his ungloved, cayused palm directly against the thick, vibrating metal housing of the main bearing. Then, he tilted his head, closing his eyes completely, and placed his ear right against the cold iron hull of the machine. Look at him, one of the junior engineers whispered loudly to another. What is he doing? Hugs the machine. This isn't the 1980s. The problem is in the internal telemetry. Arthur ignored the whispers. In his mind, the noise of the room faded away. Through the palm of his hand and the bone of his jaw, pressed against the metal, he felt the machine's pulse. He didn't see lines of code. He felt the kinetic energy, the invisible waves of micro-vibrations, traveling through the steel architecture. And there, buried deep within the core of the 5-ton structure, he heard it, a tiny, irregular, high-pitched drum click. It was a sound that no computer microphone could isolate from the ambient noise, But to Arthur's 30 years of experience, it was as loud as a thunderclap. It was the sound of a machine suffocating under its own perfection. Arthur slowly opened his eyes and stood up straight, wiping a smudge of black grease from his cheek with the back of his hand. The silence in the room was dense, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans from the other 49 frozen machines. Victoria was staring at him, her hands clenched into fists, her patience worn down to a microscopic thread. "Well?" she demanded, her voice dripping with a defensive mixture of anxiety and arrogance. "Have you finished your little performance? If you're going to tell me that the machine needs to be hit with a wrench, you can save your breath and get out." Arthur looked at her, his eyes steady, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light of the ceiling. "Your machine doesn't need a wrench, Victoria, and it doesn't need a software patch. Your $5 million system is failing because your German engineers forgot that no matter how advanced a computer is, it still has to move physical steel." The head engineer stepped forward, his tablet still clutched defensively against his chest. "What are you talking about? The internal telemetry shows that the main drive shaft has 0 deviation. The laser alignment is accurate, down to the nanometer. The laser alignment is measuring the outside of the shaft," Arthur said calmly, turning his gaze back to the massive iron housing. "But inside the secondary distribution gearbox, you have an automated electronic tensioner. It uses a hydraulic micropiston to adjust the pressure on the silk feeding line based on your AI algorithms. Am I right?" The engineer blinked, his mouth dropping open slightly. "Yes. How did you know that?" "That's proprietary design layout." "Because I've repaired the mechanical ancestors of this machine for 30 years, Arthur said, taking his vintage steel screwdriver out of his side pocket. "Your AI noticed that the silk thread from the new supplier was 0.02% thicker than the previous batch. So, the software did exactly what it was programmed to do. It commanded the hydraulic piston to tighten the tensioner to maintain uniform fabric weight. But it tightened it too much. It forced the main drive gear against the housing wall, creating a thermal lock. The computer thinks everything is fine, because the electronic circuits are perfect, but the metal gears are literally fusing together under the pressure." Victoria frowned, looking between Arthur and her head engineer. "Is that even possible?" she asked, her voice losing a fraction of its iron certainty. The head engineer frantically tapped on his tablet, his eyes darting across lines of mechanical schematics. Suddenly, his face went completely pale. "Oh my God, he's right. The temperature in the secondary casing is rising, but the sensor is placed on the primary manifold. The software isn't reading the localized thermal expansion. The shaft is jammed tight." Panic flared back into Victoria's eyes. She turned to her engineers. "Then override it. Send a command to the piston to release the pressure." "We can't, ma'am," the engineer stammered, his voice cracking. "Because the shaft is physically jammed. The electronic safety protocol has locked the entire command interfaces. The software thinks any manual adjustment will warp the gears. It's a digital deadlock. We can't move the piston without restarting the main mainframe, and the mainframe won't restart while the safety lock is active." Victoria felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. A $30 million contract, the livelihood of her workers, her entire reputation. All trapped in a loop of flawless digital logic that was destroying itself in the real world. She looked at Arthur, her eyes wide, realizing that the old man in the faded denim jacket was the only person in the room who truly understood the monster she had built. "Can you fix it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, the arrogance completely draining from her face. Arthur did not answer immediately. He looked down at his right hand, where his knuckles were swollen from arthritis, a dull ache throbbing in his joints from the damp night air. He could feel the immense weight of the metal he would have to manipulate. Then he looked over at Amelia, who was standing quietly by the cutting table, her beautiful hand-woven dress resting inside her open folder. "I can fix it," Arthur said softly. "But my labor is not for sale to you. Before I touch this machine, we are going to make a deal." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, her corporate instincts flaring up. "If it's about money, I can write you a check right now. Name your price. 10,000? 20,000? Arthur let out a short, quiet laugh, a sound that made Victoria freeze. "You still think everything in this world has a price tag that can be written on a piece of paper, don't you? I don't want your money, Victoria. I want justice." He pointed a thick, scarred finger toward Amelia's design folder. "My daughter spent 3 months weaving that fabric with her own hands. She didn't use a $1 million algorithm. She used her heart, her time, and the skills passed down by her mother. You threw her dream into the garbage bin because you said manual craftsmanship was a fairy tale for poor people who don't belong in your high-tech world." Arthur stepped closer to the CEO, his massive frame completely dominating her space, though his voice remained perfectly calm. "Here is my deal. I will give you 2 minutes of my manual labor to save your empire. In return, you will bring that garbage bin over here. You will personally retrieve my daughter's project, and you will grant her the full scholarship she earned. If you refuse, you can wait for your parts from Munich while your company burns." Victoria gasped, her face flushing with deep humiliation. To be told what to do by an old mechanic in front of her entire engineering staff was a bitter pill to swallow. She looked around the room, but every engineer quickly looked down at the floor, unable to offer any alternative. "The clock is ticking, Victoria," Arthur said, his hand resting lightly on his screwdriver. "You have exactly 10 seconds to decide." Victoria's chest heaved as she stared at Arthur. Every corporate bone in her body screamed at her to refuse, to call security, to preserve her absolute authority. But then her eyes flicked to the massive wall clock ticking down toward the international showcase, and then to the digital monitor, where the localized temperature reading was creeping into the danger zone. Her empire was suffocating. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. With trembling hands and a face burning crimson under the harsh fluorescent lights, Victoria turned around. She walked slowly, every step of her high heels sounding like a heavy heartbeat against the concrete floor, toward the corner office where the discarded folders lay. The entire engineering team held their breath, refusing to make eye contact with their bosses. As she reached into the recycling bin, pulled out Amelia's design folder, and wiped a smudge of dust off the cover with her sleeve. She walked back, holding the folder out toward Amelia with a stiff, robotic extension of her arm. The scholarship is yours," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "The board will sign the official papers first thing in the morning." Amelia didn't move immediately. She looked at her father. Arthur gave her a small, reassuring nod. Only then did the young girl step forward and take her project back, holding it against her chest like a shield. 2 minutes, old man," Victoria hissed, trying to claw back whatever dignity she had left. "The deal is struck. Fix it." Arthur didn't waste a single second on words. He immediately unzipped his denim jacket and threw it onto a nearby workbench. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt, rolling them up to reveal thick, scarred forearms doused in years of heavy mechanical labor. He didn't look at the main digital interface. Instead, he dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp edge that shot through his arthritic joints as they hit the cold concrete. He crawled straight under the massive, 5-ton belly of machine number 1, navigating the maze of high-voltage cables and hydraulic lines until he was staring directly up at the secondary distribution gearbox housings. "Bring me a flashlight and the manual release lever," the head engineer shouted, trying to be useful. "Keep your flashlights," Arthur's voice boomed from beneath the iron beast. "Your eyes will lie to you in the dark, but your fingers won't." Working completely by touch in the narrow, pitch-black space under the machine, Arthur located the high-pressure hydraulic casing. The metal was burning hot, radiating a fierce heat that made sweat instantly pour down his face, soaking his collar. His arthritis flared up, a blinding pain throbbing in his right hand as he tried to grip the vintage steel screwdriver. He gritted his teeth, pressing his left palm hard against the iron frame to steady his body. He found the pressure release valve, a tiny, recessed steel pin that the electronic safety lock had frozen shut. The software had cut off all hydraulic power, meaning the pin was under thousands of pounds of stagnant, mechanical pressure. No human hand could push it back. Arthur reached into his front shirt pocket and pulled out the unremarkable 50-cent brass knob he had taken from his safe. Up on the floor, Victoria and the engineers stared at the underbelly of the machine, listening to the heavy, strained breathing of the old man. "What is he doing down there?" Victoria muttered anxiously, her eyes glued to the temperature monitor. "He's just an old mechanic. If he breaks that casing, the whole line is totaled." "Quiet," Amelia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an unshakable authority that made the CEO snap her mouth shut. "Let my father work." Underneath, Arthur carefully aligned the worn, grooved edges of the 50-cent brass knob with the tip of the locked hydraulic pin. It was a perfect, old-world fit. Because the brass knob was slightly softer than the modern hardened steel of the machine, it wouldn't score or damage the proprietary valve, but its specific weight would allow a perfect transfer of kinetic force. Arthur positioned the back of his heavy steel screwdriver against the brass knob. He had only one shot at this. If he struck too hard, the valve would shatter, spraying scalding hydraulic fluid into his face. If he struck too softly, the metal lock would remain fused. He closed his eyes, listening to the high-pitched, suffocating thrum-click of the jammed shaft through the iron chassis. He waited for the exact microsecond when the machine's thermal expansion reached its peak vibration. No. Using the heel of his tough, calused palm like a hammer, Arthur struck the back of the screwdriver with a short, explosive burst of raw, human strength. Clan. The sound echoed through the entire production hall, like a gunshot. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The monitors remained red. Victoria let out a sharp, bitter breath, preparing to call the police. Then a deep, guttural sachete clank vibrated through the floorboards. A heavy hiss of escaping compressed air rushed out of the secondary gearbox. On the main control station, the red flashing lights suddenly flickered, turned amber, and then with a clean, electronic chime, snapped into a bright, beautiful, solid emerald green. The safety lock, it just cleared. The head engineer screamed, jumping out of his chair. The hydraulic pressure dropped by 40%. The thermal overload is receding. Arthur crawled out from beneath the machine, his face covered in black soot and sweat, his right hand shaking slightly from the sheer physical strain. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had simply done an honest day's work. He picked up his denim jacket from the bench and calmly slid the 50-cent brass knob back into his pocket. "Reboot the mainframe," Arthur said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "The drive shaft is free. It will turn now." The head engineer's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the system override commands. A low, rhythmic growl began to build deep within the belly of machine number 1. The massive main flywheel shivered for a microsecond, then plunged forward into a flawless, high-speed spin. Instantly, the synchronized relay signaled the other 49 machines down the line. One by one, they roared to life like a sleeping army awakened by a single command. The air filled with the familiar, deafening melody of thousands of shuttle looms dancing across silk threads, a beautiful symphony of spinning metal and weaving fibers. On the digital monitors, the production output bar immediately shot from 0 to 100% efficiency. The $30 million contract was saved. Victoria collapsed back against the edge of a control terminal, but her face completely pale, staring at the emerald green monitors in utter disbelief. The young engineers around her broke out into spontaneous cheers, hugging one another as the impending disaster dissolved into a triumph of production. But as the celebration grew, the head engineer quietly stepped away from his monitors and walked toward Arthur. He didn't look at the old man with condescension anymore. His eyes were filled with a deep, professional reverence. "Sir," the engineer said, bowing his head slightly as he extended his hand. "I have a master's degree in automation from the State Institute, but what you just did, no textbook could ever teach that. You didn't just fix a machine, you saved this entire facility." Arthur looked at the young engineer's hand, then down at his own, which was covered in a thick layer of grease and charcoal soot. With a calm, gentle smile, Arthur shook the young man's hand, leaving a prominent black smudge across his clean skin. "A degree teaches you how the machine should work when everything is perfect, son," Arthur said softly. "But 30 years on the factory floor teaches you how it behaves when it's hurting. Never stop listening to the metal." Victoria slowly stood up and walked toward Arthur. The arrogance that had defined her entire posture since they first met was gone, replaced by a heavy, humbling realization. She looked at Arthur's swollen, arthritic knuckles, then down at the 50-cent brass knob peeking slightly out of his jacket pocket. "How much?" she whispered, her voice cracking over the noise of the weaving looms. "The scholarship for your daughter is a guarantee. I give you my word. But name your personal price for this. A consultant fee? A corporate position as our chief mechanical supervisor? I can double whatever you make at your small workshop." Arthur slid his hands into his jacket pockets and shook his head. "I told you before, Victoria, my labor is not for sale to you. I didn't come here for your money or your corporate titles. I came here because my daughter's dream deserved to be seen, and because 300 innocent workers on this floor shouldn't lose their livelihood. Just because their leader is too proud to look down at the foundation they stand on." He walked over to Amelia, gently taking her hand. Together, the father and daughter turned away from the multi-million-dollar digital command center and began walking toward the exit. "Wait," Victoria called out, her voice desperate, as she took a few hurried steps after them. "At least tell me what that piece of metal was. The piece you used to clear the lock. Our systems couldn't find a solution, but that tiny piece did. What is it called?" Arthur stopped at the threshold of the massive glass doors. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly across the vast room. "It's an old mechanical calibration knob from a 40-year-old loom. If you take it to a scrap yard, they'll give you 50 cents for the weight of the brass," Arthur said, his tone rich with a quiet irony. But out here in the real world, it's called a reminder. It reminds us that no matter how high you build your digital towers, they will always rely on the strength of a manual foundation. Good night, Victoria. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them, cutting off the deafening roar of the factory floor and plunging them into the cool, quiet midnight air. As they walked toward the old, rattling pickup truck, Amelia reached out and hugged her father's arm tightly, burying her face into his worn denim jacket that still smelled faintly of oil and cinnamon tea. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, a tear of relief rolling down her cheek. "You showed them." Arthur looked up at the starless night sky, his heart finally finding peace as he started the truck's engine. The old dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a warm glow over his tired face. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and his hands would still ache on rainy mornings. But tonight, the legacy of human hands had won.